I just wanted to see what ChatGPT would say if I asked it this question: who is at fault for the Ukraine war and why? So the ChatGPT response was, the war in Ukraine is the fault of Russia and its leadership under Vladimir Putin. The main reasons for this conclusion are: one, Russia's direct aggression; unprovoked invasion. Russia launched a full-scale military attack on Ukraine, violating international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. Two, Crimean annexation. In 2014, Russia previously seized Crimea, setting a precedent for territorial aggression. Russia has ignored agreements like the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, in which it pledged to respect Ukraine's borders in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. Putin's expansionist goals. Putin has falsely claimed Ukraine is not a real country and has historically downplayed Ukraine's sovereignty. His stated goal of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine has no factual basis and serves as a pretext for conquest. The counter-arguments in Russia's justifications. Some argue that NATO expansion played a role in Russia's aggression as Moscow saw Ukraine's Western alignment as a threat. However, Ukraine was not close to joining NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance and has never invaded Russia. Russia had other diplomatic options instead of launching a war. Conclusion: the war is Russia's responsibility. While geopolitical tensions exist, nothing justifies an invasion, massive war crimes, and the suffering caused to millions of Ukrainians. So, pretty clear side from ChatGPT.
Right. That's a pretty good restatement of the mainstream take on these events, on the launch of the SMO.
Right. I would say that this is why you have that. This is the training data that GPT is trained on is
right.
Is
so you used all those phrases. I think recently I was debunking them. You unprovoked and unjustified. Right. Again, it is provoked, and we'll get into that a little bit here. And then full-scale evasion. They always say full-scale invasion. And that's exactly what it was not. We're talking about 100,000 Russian soldiers, 50,000 Donbass militia, which was just a greatly outnumbered, actually, by the Ukrainian forces that were out in the field at the time. Couldn't possibly take a city like Kiev, much less all of Ukraine. So it was not a full-scale invasion. It wasn't close to it. So that their ChatGPT is repeating a lie. That's what AI does. Is it goes and collects the data that's out there and organizes it. But if the data is false, it's going to give you a false answer, and I think that's just plain false. Well, there's a lot to get in there. Let's see. Maybe one thing I'd like to point out is that in fact this did not come out of the blue. That's sort of the way that it's treated, like a complete surprise. Not only the Russians were warning that NATO's eastward expansion, and in particular its increasing meddling in Ukraine, which is real. Saying that, okay, well, maybe Ukraine wasn't going to become a member of NATO soon, but Ukraine had been put on the path to NATO membership, and so that was something again that not only had the Russians warned against many, many times, saying, hey, this is a red line for us, but U.S. government officials recognized that it was a red line and could lead to war. There was a memorandum, I think, in around 2007, the mid-2000s, from the then U.S. ambassador to Russia, and then the most recent, under Biden, the head of the CIA, William Burns. It's known this particular kind of memorandum that was sent back to from Russia when he was an ambassador to the U.S. is known as "Niet means Niet." It was released by WikiLeaks, and he's saying, hey, the Russians are very serious about that. They take this threat to make Ukraine a member of NATO extremely seriously, and any direct intervention by the Western powers in Ukraine crosses the brightest of red lines. I think that's the exact phrase that he used. And he also emphasized that this is not Putin, this is the entire Russian leadership. They all see this as the brightest of red lines. So the Americans knew. They knew how important this was. And they crossed that brightest of red lines. they crossed it first, most importantly in 2014 with the, the Maidan push, you could call it, the coup that was carried out with CIA help. Actually, quite openly. Again, we had the conversation between Victoria Nuland and
Jeffrey P.
I guess it was, yeah,
Jeffrey, the ambassador, right?
Right, the ambassador at the time, right, to Ukraine, right, exactly. And so, I remember hearing that before the coup, and she's saying, this Yats is going to be our guy. Sure enough, there's a coup. Yats is the guy who takes over, and later he's replaced by Poroshenko. It was one of the most public coups in the history of this, of the world, really, and it's certainly modern history. And in that right there was the crossing of a very bright red line. And here's one place again where ChatGPT lied, or rather repeated the lies of mainstream media sources in the U.S. government. He said that the Russians violated the Budapest memorandum. That was an agreement back in the early 90s, say that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons. That's actually not really an accurate description, because those nuclear weapons never belonged to Ukraine. In fact, like all the codes, they were Moscow's nuclear weapons, but they would just let them be returned to Moscow and exchange that, for Russia's, for not just Russia, but the U.S. side as well. But both agreed that they wouldn't meddle, and attempt to intervene directly in Ukraine, attempt an overthrow of a government, invade, whatever. Well, what happened first? It wasn't that Russia violated it. It was that the U.S. did. They violated the Budapest Memorandum with the Maidan coup. And so, that was, again, this was something that was very alarming to the Russians. Now, sometimes you get people, they shouldn't be. NATO's like, again, this is something that the ChatGPT said. NATO's purely a defensive alliance, right? What do they have to fear about it? If it expands to Ukraine, it's what sort of threat does that present to Russia? Well, the truth is, it's not purely a defensive alliance. We've seen that in recent history. In Serbia, we also saw that in Libya, and the Russians observed both events and understood that what NATO was and the danger it caused, and there was. When there was this talk about bringing NATO in, let's say after the coup and after the annexation of Crimea, it became clear that there were many forces within Ukraine that wanted to take back Crimea, and they were building up their forces with NATO help to do that. And what Lavrov and others have pointed out is that if they became a member of NATO, and then they launched this coup, or whatever, didn't launch a coup, but rather attempted to take back Crimea, Russia could very easily find itself in a war with all of NATO. Because of course, you'd say, well, this is, how things are always spun in the media. It might have been completely an offensive, unprovoked offensive operation by Ukraine, but it'll be spun that somehow the Russians were responsible for it, and then therefore all NATO must pile in. And that's what they're looking at. Now you say, well, okay, maybe this fear was excessive, but let's just stop and step back a moment and look at Russian history. Russia has been invaded through Ukraine, through the territory that we now call Ukraine, several times over the centuries. The most recent, of course, was the invasion by Germany in Operation Barbarossa. And let's just stop and think about what that did to Russia. I think most Americans don't really have a full appreciation of the Russian sacrifice. The Russians lost 27 to 28 million people. 27 to 28 million people were killed, died in this invasion as a direct result of this invasion. And that is, that's just an astronomical figure. We talk about our sacrifices during World War II, and it's right to do that. And they were considerable, but we're just talking about 500,000. 500,000 to perhaps 28 million. That's and the population of Russia was also smaller, or the Soviet Union at that time was smaller than that of the U.S. So it's just again the sacrifice is so huge. It's only natural that, like what Putin himself was just said, well, this is like, one of my main duties as the president of Russia, that we can never let this happen again. This is a real fear that's well founded. And then when you look at Ukraine, not only was this a buildup of forces that was quite obvious, and they had reason, prior to the launch of the SMO in 2022, they could see this continued buildup, this arms flowing in from NATO, and they had troops in a number that was, that were really quite beyond what was needed for defense. They believed that they were planning an offensive operation. I don't know for sure that they were, but before the SMO began, and even before the Donbass republics declared their independence, there was a very sharp spike in artillery attacks on the Donbass by the Ukrainian forces. We're not just talking a little uptick of 10%, but it tripled, quadrupled during the days leading up to it. And the Russians thought really did, or they say they did, that they believed that they were about to attack. So this notion that it was unprovoked is just absurd. It's absolutely absurd. They knew that it was a provocation. I think it was, it seems clear that actually, like, NATO knew that what they were going to do was going to lead to war. Their own people had been telling them, like William Burns, for example, this is going to lead to war. But they were looking forward to it because they thought that this would be a chance to destroy Russia. I've heard there was a Munich security. We recently had a Munich security conference. Again, where was very, very different from the one that occurred in 2022, which took place just before the launch of the SMO. But that has been described. I'm thinking by Alexander Mercouris in particular, who observed that very closely as being sort of a euphoric conference. Now, why are everybody was just sort of giddy with anticipation, and war was in the air. They knew that there was war, just in the immediate future. Why would they be happy? Why would they be just, rubbing their hands with glee? It's because they thought that this was a chance to destroy Russia. They really did. And clearly it's failed, of course, but that's where we are. So yeah, if you want to say really who's responsible above all, you have to, I'll get to clearly it was provoked. Now, of course, Russia did have a choice of whether or not to launch the SMO, which you have to say is a major escalation. They chose to escalate, but of course there were these bright red lines that were being crossed, and the West knew that they were crossing. We talk about how often Russia does not respond, but this is one case where they did. They weren't the first ones to escalate. You have to go back to coup, and actually there's a lot longer history, but I just don't have the time to go into it. But let's say the coup in Maidan, and the constant shelling of Donetsk, all that, and the talk about bringing in, the promises. It's more than just talk. Promises to bring Ukraine into NATO. All of these were escalations. The flooding of arms into Ukraine. This was an escalation, and then the Russians responded with their own escalation. Now, you can argue that was a mistake, but it was, and you could argue, I think a reasonable person can argue that it was unjustified, but it clearly was provoked. It clearly was. So, yeah, who's primarily responsible for this? The answer really is simple. It's the U.S. Actually, much more so than Europe. It's kind of funny now because the U.S. is walking away from it or appears to be under the Trump administration, and the Europeans are just holding on to, this anti-Russian crusade. But that's not how it began. I mean, if you go back into the mid-2000s, that's when, the talk about bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO began. And the Europeans, the main European powers, in particular, Germany and France, rejected it. Like Merkel very clearly said that this is something we don't want. It was proposed by the Bush administration, and they came out against it. At that time, there was still some independence in Europe. They weren't pure vassals of the United States, but it was already the European sovereignty had already been greatly weakened. So the Bush administration just turned the screws, bent some arms, and then Merkel and Hollande and the rest of them, or it may have been Sarkozy even back then, said, okay, we'll do it. But it was actually, the U.S. had to apply the pressure. So anyway, now the U.S., this is sort of typical, right? We've seen this happen in different ways. They convinced these different countries here, basically all of Europe, to join this crusade with them, and it led to war. And now that the U.S. is walking away, it's the Europeans who initially were resistant, who did not want to become involved, who saw the dangers. I mean, Merkel, said, this could lead to war. So, it's not like nobody knew what they were doing, but they gave up their sovereignty, and now they're just, they're in this mess, and they don't really, and they seem to have lost the ability to think for themselves and to actually reconsider the choices that they made. And these are choices. They're choices to follow the U.S. And you see the mess that we have now.
Yeah. Do you think that there will ever be a recognition of this from the United States or just globally after this war is done? I mean, will there be an adjudication, you know what I mean? That this is a recognition of why this all happened and who there's to blame. I mean, they say history is written by the victors, so the Russians are going to win, but will history recognize that? Will the U.S. be able to recognize that? The Western European countries recognize that?
It's hard to say. I mean, of course, we've had a change in narrative that's significant. We hope that it will continue under the Trump administration. But he has one thing you notice is that he never blames the U.S. He doesn't really recognize the U.S. role in this. He puts all the blame on Zelensky. And sure, Zelensky has to share some of the blame. But again, he was like the rest of Europe. He got pushed into it. He agreed to do it. So, we can't deny his agency and he has some share in the blame. But he was pressured, pushed into it, given promises, assurances by the U.S.-led coalition, and went along with it. So you can't, I think it really is a rewriting of history to point the finger at Zelensky and say he's the one who started it. And that's essentially what Trump said in an earliest statement of his.
Do you think when my son is reading a history book, what will it say? I mean, will it depend on what country you're in? I mean, if you're part of the United States and if you're in China,
no, it's a good question. I don't know. Again, there would have to be a real revolution, and that could happen. But it's but not by. You're not going to see that under any of the current governments. I don't think. I think even under Trump, there's going to be Trump's version of history is that the U.S. is. Well, U.S. power is U.S. power is basically always on the side of good. So, I think even if Trump goes ahead with these reforms, unless it goes much deeper than I expect, we're going to continue to see the same narrative. I mean, it's taken a little bit of a beating. We have to admit. That's why you're seeing that debate online. There's the beginnings of a debate, and maybe that'll go somewhere. Perhaps I shouldn't be too pessimistic. But there's a lot of pushback. I was just looking at media reports or opinion pieces in pro-Trump newspapers like the New York Post, Republican-leaning publications. And they were very happy about the meeting between Zelensky and Trump and the fact that, he's not calling him a dictator anymore. They were quite upset about that. So, there's still a very strong part of the Republican establishment, even the Trump-supporting Republican establishment, that's very much, supports the old narrative and wants to see it come back. Now, it has to be said that I think, like in the general electorate, there has been a real shift. The comments that Trump has made has affected the opinions that the average Trump voter, let's say, or even the average voter has towards Ukraine, because they never heard Ukraine criticized before. And now they heard it and they began to, so a lot of people, well, there are those who are fanatically devoted to Trump. They're going to echo whatever he says. But, clearly through this, it's not just Trump, but actually very reasoned comments coming from, and well-founded comments coming from Hegseth and Marco Rubio. Hopefully that's seeping through and is starting to have an effect. We have a ways to go before we actually get to a fundamental change of the narrative, where a reckoning of what the U.S. involvement, because that goes well beyond Ukraine. It's really about U.S. hegemony. And it's not clear to me that at all that Trump really wants to give up on U.S. hegemony. I think he just has maybe a more realistic overall, even though his grasp of the facts can be pretty weak, but it's just sort of a greater appreciation of the realities. But U.S. hegemony nonetheless.
Guys, thanks for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please check out my website, nobliski.io. You can look at the pinned comment below. It's something that I think you'll find useful. Even my dad uses it. My wife uses it. Instead of Googling things, you should be using this website because you get access to OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, DeepSeek. There's hundreds of models that you can use. It's what I use to create the thumbnail images, things like this. And the greatest thing about it is there's no rate limits. There are no subscription fees. It's free to try out and use. You get free tokens every day. So if you're not a heavy AI user, you will never have to pay for anything. But this is really my passion project. I really want to get it off the ground, and I think you guys would like it. So yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you have time to download the apps and give it 5 stars, that'd mean a lot to me as well. Thanks a lot.